My name is Kelly Bricker, and I'm a professor in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism at the University of Utah. For the Tourism and Protected Areas Specialist Group, I also chair the Capacity Building Working Group, and that's what we're doing here today, is providing this particular webinar. Next, I will give you an introduction to the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Tourism and Protected Areas Specialist Group, or TAPAS. We advocate for a future where tourism enhances the conservation integrity of protected area systems, improves human well-being, provides accessible, inspiring, safe, and educational opportunities, and environmentally, social, cultural, and economically sustainable experiences. The Tourism and Protected Areas Specialist Group is one of several voluntary groups convened under the International Union for Conservation of Nature World Commission on Protected Areas. It is a network of over 500 volunteers committed to promoting sustainable tourism in protected areas globally. And thank you for all of those that are on the call today that are a member of our network. So what do we do? Well, we produce and disseminate knowledge on tourism in protected areas through the IUCN and our partners. Our publications have included journal, special editions, and technical reports such as best practice guidelines and guidance on tourism concessions and partnership guidelines. TAPAS build capacity through workshops, webinars like this, on topics such as visitor impacts, over-tourism, and topics like today and other issues that are important to our network. We also network among our members and broadly to link and engage with others working in the field of tourism and protected areas. Sometimes we do this online, such as through our Google group mailing list and social media, and sometimes face-to-face. For example, during the International Year of Sustainable Tourism, we co-organized an international conference on sustainable tourism in small island developing states in the Seychelles. The TAPAS group is coordinated by a committed volunteer executive committee that supports members on issues of communities and heritage, biodiversity, and economics. Here are just some of the online links you can use to find out more about the TAPAS group, join, get involved, and communicate with others. I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Paul F.J. Eagles is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Canada. His primary appointment was to the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies, with cross-appointment to the School of Planning. He specializes in environmental, recreation, and tourism planning with 45 years of planning experience. He undertook planning and research in these fields in over 40 countries and has over 410 publications, of which 142 are refereed. We are thrilled to have Paul giving his personal opinion about the Canadian park system today in light of COVID. Welcome, Paul.
All right, let's scale back to just, all right, good. So I'm going to just deal with Canada and some very brief information. Parks and protected areas of various types. We have a long history, several hundred years in Canada. We have a lot. As of yesterday, the protected planets say we have 8,256, covering 11% of the country. Now that sounds great, but it's a problem in that we have a lot of area to manage. The last tabulation of visitor use is 115 million visitor days, and what's interesting about that, that's a publication that I did 20 years ago, and no one's updated it, which shows you how important visitor data is in Canada. A lot of people are not collecting the data. And these data do not include the thousands of municipal parks in Canada or their use. Now, Canada quickly jumped on the bandwagon in March and imposed restrictions on use. I consider them draconian, and many of them are unnecessary. All provincial, national, and regional parks were closed to public use. Many municipal parks were closed. Some were open for some use, which was quite a bit of confusion of what was open and what you could do and what you couldn't. And there was vigorous legal enforcement of public use. Now, my initial reaction is this is not appropriate. That many of these park use restrictions force people into higher levels of human density than is healthy. If you live in a large Canadian city, which we have many, about half the people live in dense apartments. There's more chance of social distancing outside than there is inside. Well, we were told by governments we're not allowed to spread into our many parks, trails, and open spaces. I consider this exactly the opposite of what is needed to maintain effective social distancing levels. So, that's just a very little bit of background. You're familiar with that. You probably have similar circumstances where you live. This is my next point, and I think it's critically important, is that the public health models that are being used to restrict use are based on indoor situations from research in laboratories and hospitals. As far as I can find, there's only one documented case of outdoor transfer of virus, and that's in China. No such cases have been found in Canada, and that's after 4.5 million cases. So the chances of getting it outside are incredibly low. All right, it took a long time for public health to recognize this. And finally, a few weeks ago, Bonnie Henry of British Columbia, the official medical officer of health, stated, and I'll read it, "The public is at little risk of contracting the coronavirus while outside." The provincial health officer has stated, calling that possibility both negligible and infinitesimally small. Something that I felt was the situation from the beginning, but I have no ability to make that information public, but now I do. Now, her statement has started to move across the country and force governments into a more flexible outdoor recreation management strategy. I think there's an important point here. This movement of opening our parks again was started by a public health official and not by any park agency spokesperson, not by any outdoor recreation advocate, or not by any environmental NGO activist. Now, in all those three, park agency people, outdoor recreation people, environmental activists have been silent, as far as I have heard, in the public discussion of visitor use in Canadian parks. Now, the parks in Canada are now opening. The time is appropriate. We're entering our warm summer season, and the demand is really high. Right now, they're only typically open for day use. You can't stay there in their many campgrounds. So, the question I ask, why has Parks and Recreation Management, both government and private, been so weak in responding to this unprecedented shutdown of outdoor recreation activities? So I'm going to offer my opinions of what I think is going on. I think, and I thought from the very beginning, that this restriction of outdoor activities was wrong for three reasons. It's much better to socially isolate from other people outside than inside in most places in the world. Second, outside there's a continual movement of air, moving breath particles out and away in dilution, way more than inside. And third, the cleansing action of sunlight, specifically ultraviolet A and B on surfaces. Well known. That's why we use ultraviolet as a radiation in a variety of public health circumstances. So here's my conclusions. The public health policy in Canada has been in error in extrapolating indoor experimental findings to outdoor activities. 2, the park and outdoor recreation management in Canada is politically weak. We do not have, or people in parks and recreation don't have a strong public voice. And park managers, even if they see what I have seen, are not allowed to speak publicly. and they have to raise it through a hierarchical system. So they must go up to a director and then to a minister and so on before they're allowed to speak. This severely limits their ability to make the comments that I'm making. Most parks and recreation management in Canada does not have productive relationship with post-secondary institutions, tourism bodies, and other allied groups that could have helped them in this debate. And I want to comment, there is one group that have had amazing success. It's a group here in Ontario called Landscape Ontario. It's an NGO formed of all landscape companies, garden centers, flower growers, tree growers, and sales of plants. And they've been lobbying government to allow them to continue their activities successfully. That has not happened in the parks movement. My fourth summary, park management at national and provincial levels is largely land management. There is a visitor and tourism management, but it's secondary, and it's not got nearly the importance that I think it should have. My fifth point, park tourism and visitor management is not conducted with a coordinated and professional framework. It's a secondary activity. So these people are scarce. There are few of them on the ground. The park agencies are badly understaffed. Those that are there their mandate of providing visitor services are secondary to environmental protection, ecological protection. My sixth point, park management organizations lack of visitor use policy targets. I've been suggesting, as an example, to Parks Canada, who runs our national parks, they should have a policy that every citizen of Canada shall visit a national park once in their lifetime. Measurable and attainable. We have no such deadlines or guidelines anywhere. 7. National park NGOs have not been at all helpful. They're largely ecologically oriented and are not supportive of visitor use. And in fact, during this period, many of them are lobbying against allowing citizens into the parks for ecological reasons. Well, what's happening? The parks are opening. They're becoming more used. There's tremendous political pressure, and it's all coming from grassroots activities by park visitors and outdoor recreations themselves that are doing that. And social media is amazingly powerful here. As I'm closeted in my den, I'm able to, and I'm continually communicating with political leaders and policy leaders online daily. And it's more direct than I've ever had before. For example, I'm speaking to the local city mayor online frequently, and my regional chair, and my member of parliament, and so on, online. And these people are getting this grassroots activity clearly. So as I like to do, I'd like to make some recommendations, and I've got 5 of them here. This pandemic and the closure of the parks makes it clear that park use and outdoor recreation must be recognized as a widespread public health benefit, not a disbenefit. We've been talking about this for a while, but it's not going quickly and well enough as far as I'm concerned. Second recommendation, park management must fully recognize the important role of visitor use and tourism in parks through new organizational policies, more professional staff in tourism and visitor management with appropriate education, and better linkages to the full range of tourism management organizations. Parks must come out of their shell and work with outside organizations that are also providing visitor services. Third, parks and outdoor recreation bodies must establish visitor policies that involve measurable market penetration goals so that it's clear when you stop them or change them, you're affecting their overall goal, such as a goal for outdoor activity, a certain level of exposure to nature. We have no such quantifiable goals. Recommendation number 4, park management agencies must develop ongoing research and management linkages with post-secondary institutions and tourism organizations. They are weak In fact, they're getting weaker. They used to be stronger in previous decades than they were before. And my fifth one is a big one, but it has to be said. Canada needs a national visitor and tourism NGO whose function is to support the use of public parks and outdoor recreation spaces across the country. The environmental NGOs are great at creating parks, but they're not good at providing money to manage them and not good at encouraging Canadian citizens and others to visit them. So that's the nub of my statement, and hopefully that's enough that we can now, I can go on to have a discussion after Jim talks.
Thank you, Paul. That's wonderful. And I think we could open it up for some questions and potentially discussion now. We'll carry that on for a few minutes here, and then we'll move on to Jim's presentation. Certainly in Utah, we're seeing increased use of the outdoor public spaces, about 65%, if not more in some areas. So we know that these outdoor spaces are contributing to health benefits at this juncture. But I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. I also noticed people are sharing several ideas in the chat room, which is great. We'll have a recording of that as well. Are there any questions at this juncture, or shall we continue?
Chris Lemieux says he has a question, but I don't know what it is.
Hey, Paul, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, Chris. Okay,
perfect. So I really enjoyed your presentation. Nice to see you online here. So I agree with all of your recommendations, especially number 4, related to research capacity. I've been in touch with Ontario Parks a few times, and there's just really not much interest in trying to gauge public opinion and looking at motivations and perceptions related to COVID. But my question, here in Ontario relates to, the capacity of parks to absorb the potential visitation that could have occurred if they didn't just close the doors, right?
Right.
I don't need to tell you that, a lot of the employment in our protected area sector is based on seasonal employment and students who are undergoing a lot of their own challenges right now. So, I guess what could have a park, think about the parks that you've been to. I mean, if you can think about Pinery and some of the heavily visited beach parks in Ontario, I mean, what could have they possibly done? I mean, there was a bit of a risk, right, that there would be an influx of visitors, and they needed to buy some time to manage the issue, right? And there was no one working. I mean, there's no one working at the gates. So it kind of would have been a little bit, potentially out of control. So I'm just wondering what your comments could be on that. I mean, maybe how could they manage it differently, given that, the visitation is just so high in many of our provincial parks, right?
Well, first comment, of approximately 600 protected areas in Ontario, only 110 have any visitor management now at all. The rest have none, let alone monitoring of it. If you're talking about Pinery, you're in my favorite park. They could have managed that with student employment, and I still maintain that the hiking on the trails, the walking around on the beaches, the viewing of the forest would be done with appropriate social distancing. The only issue that I could see at all was washroom cleanliness. They just had to put more staff on to make sure the washrooms, all the new ones, have excellent methods of clearing the air out, so they could restrict the number of people in the washroom and clean them, and that's all they had to do. I think they could have continued. The big problem is they're getting no income now. And there's a catch-22. Because Ontario is 90% funded from visitor fees and charges, they're in big trouble if they're not having that income. That's just a statement.
So, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, Paul. I don't want to dominate the questions here, but last comment. You and I have always kind of agreed and a little bit disagreed on the funding model for Ontario parks, because I do believe the switch to, revenue retention was important and it's essential, but it also got governments off the hook for funding. And I think we're going to see the implications of that, this year for sure, right? And at the end of the day, there's going to be no money for managing the parks because the visitation will have been hit so hard.
Yeah,
right?
No doubt. And province of
Hello,
British
Paul.
Columbia and Alberta have both gone to private sector funding, which means if there are no visitors, they don't function either. Then there's no managers in those parks. So, next question.
Hello, Paul. John Forche. I
John.
live up on the Bruce. And as far as I'm concerned, park closure, we've had instances, and I've seen other instances. There's a guy who's running a face page out of the middle of Algonquin Park. The big problem is not so much the people in day use, but we have extensive travel. They'll come up. The biggest problem is congregation, and then we get the people that go in, they take a tent. I ain't going to escape the whole thing and back in the bush. I agree that obviously there has to be some comprehensive management, but up in the Bruce, we're running into over-tourism right now. I don't believe the private sector can accommodate, never have. In fact, I don't know whether you've heard my opinions on the private sector tourism or not, but I understand where you're coming from, but the shift is huge that we'd have to do. And like I say, the bottom line here is not so much people hiking on the trails, it's what they do afterwards in the congregation. It comes down to younger people and the bush party, all that sort of stuff. And we are very stretched for groceries. We're very stretched for hospital accommodations, all these in these type of areas that come up that are usually adjacent to parks.
No comment.
Okay, I have a chat question that I'd like to go ahead and throw out there to you, Paul. Bob Chappelle, hi, welcome. He says, I assume some of the park forest closures are to protect communities. What recommendations are there to encourage better coordination between local destination managers and land managers?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question, but it gets to the nub of coordination. I'm going to give you an issue. In the county within which I live, we have 7 municipalities, regional government, a conservation area, and provincial parks and national parks are irrelevant. We have a long-distance rail trail. When in one county it is closed, in another county it's open. There's an example of big problems. So if you're bicycling on the trail, you go across the boundary, you can be fined. That is just plain a problem. But we've got to recognize that when we're forcing the people in the cities to stay inside, what are their alternatives? I have a friend. She actually goes to our church. She's a restaurant worker. She's now out of work. She can't afford an apartment. She can't afford a house. She's in a room, in a boarding house, and she can't go outside except on streets and on sidewalks, and sometimes in some parks, in some locales. That's what we're forcing people into, and for some reason those people's welfare has been forgotten, as if we all have single-family homes with backyards that we can go into. And our urban spaces, especially our urban open spaces, are critically important for outdoor spacing.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Are there any other questions? Or if there are, I think what we'll do is go ahead and move on to Jim Barborak's presentation. And Jim is the co-director of the Center for Protected Area Management at Colorado State University. Over a 40-year career as a conservation practitioner, he has worked in nearly 30 countries, including every country in Latin America. And we're noticing a lot of his former students on this webinar today, which is great. Welcome, everybody. And he's worked on issues of protected area planning, management, finance, policy, public use, governance, and training. He is an active member of the World Commission on Protected Areas and our TAPAS specialist group. So we're going to move from current situation to perhaps some ideas around extending off Paul's recommendations for the future, moving into a future scenario. So welcome, Jim.
Sharing my screen. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is not so much the situation where we are today, but rather where we are going. What's it going to be like in the post-COVID world? Unlike the draconian measures mentioned by Paul in Canada, in the United States, which is a highly decentralized country, we've already had a reopening of many of our parks, and some never closed, particularly local green space. I'm a regular user of our state park system. I'm a fisherman, and I've been going out every couple of days. All of our state parks stayed open. What was closed were restrooms, camping areas, beaches, and other places where there were large concentrations of people. So every attempt was made to eliminate personal contact. All of the pay stations closed. Everything went to automatic payment, for example, for a number of weeks. And also sanitation measures were made more extreme. Within the next 2 weeks here in Colorado, our state park campgrounds will open again. Probably our visitor centers will remain closed for a while. And even our nearby national park, Rocky Mountain, will be opening in 2 weeks. And some national parks, including the most visited in the eastern United States, have already opened. And managers are dealing with crowd control issues, of course, after people have been cooped up for a number of weeks. What I would like to say, though, is that I'm more concerned about what's going to happen after COVID. We know that this is not going to be a short emergency. It's going to be a long emergency. It's going to change people's recreational behavior and their spending patterns for a considerable period of time. Some things that we were used to doing in the past might never recover or might recover very slowly, and things like cruise ships with 5,000 passengers might be a thing of the past. Seating arrangements in restaurants, buffets, a whole series of different things that we were used to may not come back or will come back in a very different way. What is very clear around the world is that people need to recreate, and that protected areas play a huge role in people's not only physical health, but also their mental health, particularly when they've been confined for a lengthy period of time. So there's a lot of pent-up demand out there, and that is a great opportunity for our protected areas. Next slide. So I want to talk briefly about financial resilience, and what the dictionary says is that what an individual or institution does to adapt and survive financial hard times. Next slide, please. So if you go to any personal finance book, you will see a whole list of ideas on how to improve your personal financial resilience. And resilience is a term used for a long period of time by architects and engineers, talking about resilience to storms or earthquakes. Many times now it's used in the climate change literature about how do we build adaptation, research, education, and mitigation strategies in the face of climate change. Whenever you read a personal book on personal financial resilience, it often mentions these comments on building an emergency fund, maintaining insurance, limiting debt, practicing thrift, investing for the future, and developing your social capital. And what I would like to argue is that those same principles apply to us as conservationists, be it that we work in government agencies or NGOs or academia or in community development organizations or in the private for-profit sector. Next slide, please. So I would like to stress a number of things that I think that we should all be thinking about moving forward about our protected areas agencies. Obviously, if you're a small community-based ecotourism venture, or you're an NGO, which could be local, national, or international, or you're a government agency at the municipal, state, provincial, or national level, the realities of the different types of financial resources and human resources you have at your disposition are different. But I'm going to try to keep generic here the things that we should all be thinking about. First of all is know what you need to survive and thrive. Second is don't go it alone. Paul put a lot of emphasis on this, about the need for partnerships. A third thing that Paul also mentioned is make your case, make your argument. What is your value proposition? And also market and communicate it well. The fourth, for those of us particularly very dependent on one sector of tourism, is to diversify within tourism and beyond tourism. The next is to have insurance policies, just like is recommended for individuals, both real and virtual. And finally, to use this period of time of transition to build the capacity of our staff and partners. Next slide, please. So the first thing is to know what you need to survive and to thrive. In personal terms, people always say we need to have a budget. You need to know what your costs are and which of those costs are flexible, which don't vary much, and which you can live with and which you can live without. So I've talked to many protected area managers around the world, or even staff of NGOs, that when you ask them, what's your core operating budget? What's it take to maintain the basic operations of your protected area? And they don't know. It's managed by distant bureaucrats in a faraway city, and they have very little say over it and very little control over it. But it's very important to know what it takes to run your area and to keep core functions operating. A second is that this is a wonderful time, as many of us are still on lockdown, to be thinking about, do we have a clear vision for a protected area or our agency? What is our mission? As Paul mentioned, is public use and recreation part of that mission? And to have clear strategic plans for our institutions, long-term management plans for our protected areas, and business plans as well, making clear what things cost and where we can get the resources to pay for them. The next thing I'd like to mention is that we really need to know what is the absolute basic core things that we cannot fail to do, or we will have maintenance breakdowns and we will actually increase the risk of catastrophic events. What are the core functions? What does it take to keep the lights on? What does it keep to keep a minimal protection force out there? The bad guys and the bad girls are still out there. 17 rangers and support staff were killed in Virunga National Park just a few days ago. Talking to colleagues from around Latin America, all types of threats, illegal fishing, hunting, mining, invasions, etc., continue to occur apace. And so this is not a time to be reducing protection functions either. And what maintenance is absolutely necessary, or things like machinery will break down, termites will take over if we're in the tropics, and other problems of breakdown and longer term cost will increase if we don't deal with. And also, and this is something my own center is doing, we've looked at every grant we've had, and we've talked to all of our donors to extend our grants, to make the use of the different line items more flexible. And so you do everything you can, just like individuals are doing, to defer repayment of student loans, to defer repayment of home loans. And if you have other sources of funding, to deal with your donors, to deal with your financial partners, to try to make the terms as flexible as possible. As was mentioned by Paul, many parks agencies, both provincial agencies, national agencies, and NGOs that run private parks, are dealing with huge reductions in income right now. And then finally, I'd like to mention, is the crisis an opportunity? There will be many new programs in countries rich and poor around the world to create employment. Many of these will have to do with public works. Protected area agencies around the world deal with maintenance backlogs. In the United States, the National Park Service alone has over an $11 billion backlog of deferred maintenance and things like trails and visitor centers and historic buildings. So be really astute about using the upcoming emergency funds and programs, those that have already been announced and those that will be announced, to create employment opportunities, obviously giving preference to local people wherever possible, and to use the crisis as an opportunity to deal with longstanding problems and new ones that are caused by the emergency itself. Next slide, please. Another thing, and Paul mentioned, for example, in Canada, the lack of a national partner organization really pushing for public use of protected areas. In the United States, we have almost every type of recreational activity has a support group. The recreational users, the International Mountain Biking Association, hunting and fishing groups, off-road vehicle groups, and obviously the industries also have their lobbying associations. And you can imagine most of these are pushing strongly to reopen and to not excessively close opportunities for outdoor recreation, particularly where social distancing can be practiced. So be thinking about what are the partnerships you have? What are the alliances and coalitions you belong to? What friends organizations are out there? Do you have a friends association for your protected area agency? If not, I highly recommend you have one. People you can count on to go to bat for you. Do you have a participatory advisory board? These are required in many countries. I see a lot of Brazilians online. Of course, in your country, these are required under law that you have a participatory advisory board. And in some cases, they're actually deliberative boards because in extractive use areas, the local people actually have a say in decisions. They don't just advise on. And build participatory planning and management frameworks and with partners so that it's not just you going it alone. You need to build your social capital so partners have your back as you struggle to recover from what is a financial tragedy and disaster for many conservation agencies, particularly those that depend most heavily on tourism dollars to survive. To do all this, you need to make your case and communicate it well. This means that you need to document the value of your area. In Brazil recently, there was a wonderful book that came out called What is Green Worth? Basically documenting not just tourism, but all of the environmental services produced by protected areas. I highly recommend you try to document. As Paul's mentioning, we need to know how many people are coming, what they're spending in tourism, and then also what are the other benefits of your area, the health benefits, how many people practice outdoor recreation in your area, and the other environmental services your area provides aside from tourism and recreation, such as water supplies, disaster prevention, extractive activities such as fisheries, forestry, etc. And it's not enough just to document these things. Get the word out. Use partners again to get the word out, using social media, using newspapers, using TV and radio, if that's an important way of communicating in your countries, to get the word out about all of the goods and services that your protected area provides, that it's more than just tourism, but also documenting well the value of those tourism benefits. And then the other thing is, when you do reopen for business, or if you are still open, at least for some visitation, let people know. Let them know, and also be very clear about new restrictions on behavior and activities and social distancing so that people feel safe and want to come to your area and understand the new rules that will be in place when they do come to visit. The next point is to diversify within and beyond tourism. There are many areas. I mentioned the case of cruise ship tourism. I would not want to be, and I see my colleague Susie from Guatemala online. Her protected area, run by an NGO on the Caribbean coast of Guatemala, depends heavily on cruise ship visitors. This is a point in time when I would want to look for every other alternative beyond cruise ship visitors to visit my area. There are parks in Mexico that get hundreds of thousands of visitors. And in Belize, they get tens of thousands of visitors, and in many Caribbean islands from day trippers from cruise ships. So this is going to be one sector that's going to have severe reduction, and it might be long lasting. So think about other types of ways people can visit your area, other activities they can do. In particular, if you've had a great dependence on international tourists, studies done in the United States by Penn State University. Anna Spenceley has been doing some surveys in Africa. The Leave No Trace Center here in Colorado are showing that people are going in smaller groups. They're going closer to home, and they're trying to avoid traveling using public transportation. So think about whether or not you are diversifying to the way people are going to travel in the future, smaller groups, closer to home, and more dispersed activities. And then beyond tourism, what other products and services can you provide? Yesterday, I was talking to a colleague from Paraguay who's on this call today, and she was saying that her NGO is diversifying to promote more national tourism, and also things like beekeeping and with local stingless bees, and production of mate, which is an herb used in herbal teas in South America and used widely around the world. And trying to have new products and services they offer so that they basically act as insurance policies and they reduce their dependence on any one source of funding. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, create confidence among your partners and potential visitors by adapting to post-COVID health sanitation and social distancing rules. If any of you do a quick search of the United States government, for example, has put out guidelines for park and recreation providers on how to improve sanitation and health security for outdoor recreation, and many other countries and regions are doing the same. The next one is insurance policies. This is not a time to be cutting your insurance. Vehicle, fire, liability, unemployment insurance in those countries where that's required. Use this time to invest in maintenance. If you have staff that's relatively idle and can't do some things, see what maintenance you can actually increase on your physical plant, on your trails, on your signage, so that you are ready to reopen when that day comes. And another thing is to think about how to save for a rainy day, and I'll mention an opportunity from Costa Rica later. Build that social capital so your partners have your back, and continue your core protection activities at all costs. Next, build capacity of staff and partners. So take full advantage of this lull. There are an incredible number of opportunities for training online, or things you can do in-house using Zoom, using Skype as well. Just to give you an example, I've updated my Red Cross first aid certification. Other colleagues are taking interpretation courses online through the National Association of Interpretation based here in Colorado. Other colleagues, and I also do this, are spending 15 minutes a day doing Duolingo to improve our international language skills. So really take advantage of this to build your team skills and that of your partners, like local communities. And work with those communities and local entrepreneurs to prepare for tourism post-COVID, obviously in full concert with what your local, regional, and national government authorities, particularly the health authorities, are saying. And do all possible to avoid layoffs. You know, in the United States, we're up to 15% unemployment, and Canada is at 10% unemployment. Our European colleagues have done much better in using government subsidies to keep people on staff. But do all possible, if you're in a rich country or poor, to keep your core team afloat using diverse strategies and show you care. A good example, the Nature Conservancy, one of the largest international conservation NGOs, just announced to try to reduce staff furloughs. They're reducing the salaries of their highest executives. That's an example of showing that everybody's in this together. Another thing is use this opportunity to get the governance right. Do you have a participatory management council? Are you using concessions and public-private partnerships, if that would be a better way to provide a greater range and better service to visitors? So think about all of the different tools you're using regarding governance and what partnerships you have. And next, on the issue of personnel, use the whole range of different types of personnel that you can in the future. Those of you that are extremely dependent on full-time permanent personnel, particularly if you're a nonprofit agency dependent on tourism dollars, think carefully about all of the different ways you can use different types of personnel, your own, loaned, and those from other sources like contractors, concessionaires, universities, volunteers, etc. And finally, this idea of a COVID Corps. Many countries like the United States have a long tradition of using conservation corps as a means of getting youth involved in the environment and creating rural employment. I think that there will be many opportunities in countries rich and poor around the world to create new employment opportunities using COVID response resources to create opportunities to put people to work building and maintaining trails and doing other activities that are tourism related or others in protected areas. And another thing is, it's extremely important to have a diversity of funding sources and to not depend excessively on just one source. I want to show you a graph here that was done by the Nature Conservancy and UNDP as part of a study of conservation finance in Latin America. And just look at the first two at the top, Bolivia and Costa Rica. And one is whether or not you have enough money to run your protected areas or not. Although I might question those figures for Bolivia, the point is that they are dependent on external sources for the vast majority of the funding for their protected area system. I would much rather be a country like Costa Rica that says that it has most of its needs met, but where most of those resources come from the national government, of a commitment by that government to pay for conservation, rather than a country like Paraguay, which doesn't have enough money, and most of the money it does have comes from exterior sources. Next slide. And I want to end with just two examples from places I think that are doing things right. One, in full disclosure, I'm a member of the organization that runs this reserve, the Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve in Costa Rica. For the last 25 years, every time someone walks in the door, walks onto a trail, they have been using $1 of the entrance fee to create a rainy day fund. They didn't get a multi-million-dollar GEF grant, but what they've done is through very cautionary, frugal management, they built a reserve fund that's capable of getting them through over a year with absolutely no tourists going in the gate. And one of the great things is they had a minor crisis several years ago. The road was closed after a hurricane caused a washout, so they had no tourism for a few weeks, and it really helped them prepare for this much greater emergency today. But as you can see, they're doing just about everything right regarding diversifying tourism with a good business plan, a good management plan. They don't just do tourism, it's a research mecca. They have lots of partners within and beyond the community and the country, and it's just a show of all the different things you can do to increase financial diversity and create that social capital to get you through a crisis, and also have money in the bank so you don't have to have massive reductions in staff levels. The next one is an example of what I call a public-public partnership. When a small national park in southern Ecuador that was getting very little support from the government of that country was turned over to the municipal government of Cuenca, the third largest city in Ecuador for management, and they turned it over to their municipal utility, the same people that are very entrepreneurial and manage cell phones and electricity and water in the municipality. And so this is an example of a public-public partnership. So this is a great time to be thinking about whether or not you are working with other agencies of government, if you work for government at the national level, other national agencies, regional government agencies, and local government agencies to collectively work together to help you get through this financial shortfall that many of us are facing. And another thing, and I had a Venezuelan boss for many years, he was a dignitary, he was a director general of IUCN, Gerardo Burowski. And he always repeated something I think that Churchill used to say, which is, don't put a good crisis to waste. Take advantage of this opportunity and learn to roll with the punches. As mentioned, I think that instead of cruise ships, we'll probably be thinking more about small means of transportation and kayaking. Instead of thousands and thousands of people waiting to see Old Faithful go off in Yellowstone, think about contemplative opportunities for enjoying nature in smaller groups. I think that we will gradually return to our former habits, but in some destinations and for some activities, there are going to be permanent changes in behavior. And so we need to really think about a new normal and prepare for it if we expect to have financial stability in our protected areas. I just want to end with some lessons from a gentleman who's one of the greatest dignitaries of the United States has produced, Ben Franklin, one of the fathers of our country. And he was very well known for short quips, many of them having to do with frugality and financial preparedness. We didn't have a Michelangelo, we didn't have a Da Vinci, but we did have Ben Franklin. And so just very quickly to look at some of the things that he said 2.5 centuries ago that we might reflect on today that are still valid, things to be thinking about as we move forward. I would like to insist on the importance of optimism, on the importance of persistence, on the importance of teamwork and good planning to get us through this. But I am optimistic we will. The world will be somewhat changed on the other end. But if we are really studious and looking at what works elsewhere and what's worked to get us through past emergencies and what successful agencies are doing around the world, instead of trying to go it alone, then I think that most of us will get through this. We won't be unscathed, we'll be bruised, but I'm very confident that most conservation agencies, if they do adequate planning and due diligence, can recover from this current crisis, and we can actually be even more important to society in the future than we have been in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Paul Eagles here. Yeah, I'd love to compliment Jim for his wonderful talk. It's beautiful. It's basically effective management, how to produce an effectively managed operation, and everything you said was right on.
Great. We have a We have a chat question that I'll throw in. In a hypothetical case, if there is a COVID infection once the parks are open, how should a post-infection risk plan for tourism be structured?
Paul, you want to go first?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that the problem is so many parks don't even have visitor management plans to start with, let alone a risk management plan. I'm going to tell you a personal story. Ontario Parks has been hit by tornadoes 14 times in the last 20 years, and we've only had one death. But they still don't have a full risk management plan, let alone an infectious disease management plan. So what we need is a full visitor management plan for each and every site to deal with all eventualities and all goals. What are we trying to achieve? And then figure out whether we achieve them. And put the disease management as part of that.
Thanks, Paul. Jim, do you have anything to add?
I certainly concur with Paul that any protected area that receives even moderate public use needs to have an overall strategic management plan, and either a good chapter on public use planning or preferably a separate public use plan done in a participatory fashion, including all stakeholders. And particularly something I have noticed is that Paul's right that very few protected areas have risk management plans. I think we can all learn from our colleagues that work in forest fire preparation. Because the incident command system that was developed decades ago by the state of California and the U.S. Forest Service and now used around the world is a good place to start. I would also highly recommend that all protected areas authorities, public and private, be in contact with the relevant health departments at a local, regional, and national level to make sure that whatever they are saying or doing is in concordance with what their countries, municipalities, states, and provinces are recommending be done regarding sanitation. And again, as I mentioned, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, if you go to their site, have a whole document on how parks and recreation agencies can improve sanitation so that they can manage things better in a post-COVID world.
Great suggestions. And I know right here in Utah, I mean, every public space from universities to outdoor parks, from the state all the way to the national level, are trying to coordinate with our public health folks, and that's been very beneficial for a coordinated effort. Other questions or comments?
Hi there.
Yes, please, Gabrielle.
Hey, yeah. I just want to say it's just a comment, not a question. I'm from Guatemala. Hi, everyone. So, I guess now for all the national parks and recreational areas or anything, we're not counting on tourism for the next, 18 months or 12 months, whatever. But we're getting, I think, Jim was saying that people need to recreate. So I guess we're gonna get a lot of people from the same countries, like Guatemalans going to all the national parks instead of US or Canadians or Europeans. So now we're getting different opportunities in exploring more of the same, like I don't know how to say it in English, but more people from our same country to go to the recreational area. So there's a lot of different business going on, and we are right now negotiating prices on because we have different rates for from people from other countries and people from the same country. So we're renegotiating all the prices so we can get a little bit more money, so we can continue to have the park safe and all the park guards on the same salary and everything. So I just wanted to tell you that.
Thank
Gabrielle, thanks for that comment. And I would just like to point out that this is a wonderful opportunity for all protected areas that have what I might consider an unhealthy reliance on foreign high-end tourism to think about also opening their doors and being welcoming to visitors from local communities, from the region, from the nation, and from nearby countries, like in Central America, like your country. You get a lot of visitation from Mexico, from El Salvador in particular, and Honduras. So that's probably going to be the first sectors to open back up. Yes, these people don't spend as much money. Yes, they might be more frugal, but they're your residents and neighbors. And so I think it's a wonderful time to rethink our strategies to make sure we have a balanced approach between national visitation and international visitation. Understanding that those national visitors probably won't be able to pay the same level of fees and won't spend the same amount of money, but many times they tend to spend in locally owned enterprises, not in 5 stars, not in all-inclusives, so that the trickle-down effect of local expenditure and lower in tourism sometimes can be higher for each dollar spent. So definitely look at national tourism and regional tourism as you slowly reopen to international tourism.
We're also like limiting the amount of people. Before, let's say we have 250 people in the central area of the park. Now we're just going to limit it to 100. So we're just making a lot of changes, a lot of like I think there's a lot of ways right now that we can create different opportunities. We just have to be creative about it. You know, like everybody is just panicking about what's going on, how we're going to get the money. I think we are in a situation right now that we have to do something different. And like you were saying, getting people from El Salvador or from Honduras, from Mexico, it's a lot easier because they don't need to fly. They can just drive here. So it's a lot easier. Thank you.
Thank you. Great discussion. Other thoughts or ideas? We have some chat. I'm trying to keep up with that, but it's so there was a question by Evelyn. Do you have any recommendations for countries where people have scarce awareness to consider reopening to visitors? I think, Paul, you tried to address that somewhat. Maybe you can expand and offer some opportunities there.
I'm not, are you asking me what exactly is the question?
I think how to build that awareness on the importance of opening things back up for visitors to national parks.
Well, I would really like to see public health stronger emphasized. I'd like to see each park agency have a dedicated staff person to work with public health on this. That's long overdue. It should have been done a long time ago. But I'd like to point out that there are other public health issues in parks. There's dengue fever, there is, in our area, Lyme disease, there's malaria, and I got a tropical disease in Australia 4 years ago called Ross River fever. So there are other public health issues that need to be addressed in park management and not just COVID.
Great point. I think maybe COVID's putting an exclamation point on some of these practices at this point in time.
Hi, everybody.
That's fantastic. And maybe on the count of 3, we'll all wave for Isabel. And ready? 1, 2, 3. Isabel, does that help?
I'm only the translator.
Yes, it's okay.
It's certainly wonderful to see so many engaged folks on this call. Are there any other comments or questions before we end our webinar today?
Just many thanks to all of you.
Well, Paul Eagles here. I did prepare a paper. It's a week old, but I submitted it to Kelly, and I don't know how you can get a copy of that. Kelly, suggestions?
Yeah, so we're going to put all this information for the webinar, presentations, and video on the TAPAS resource site. And I believe, Isabel, tell me if I'm correct on this, that we can go ahead and respond to everybody on the call, especially with that link. Is that correct?
Yes, I think you'll have the email of everybody.
Yes.
And I will also share it on our social media. I'm going to share you the links if you are not following us, but you have to follow.
Follow us. Let's all stay together on this and keep sharing. I think these ideas and some of the discussion that started today is going to be incredibly useful going forward. So I want to again thank our special guest speakers, Dr. Eagles and Jim Barborak. Fantastic presentations. Got a lot of juices going for all of us in that COVID fog, and appreciate the clarity on some topics. And we hope to engage again this year. So welcome back when we're ready to go again with another topic area. And by the way, I do understand that many of you are TAPAS members. If you're not, we encourage you to join. This is an amazing network of professionals, practitioners, academics, park managers. So we really appreciate this incredible network that started so many years ago. So thanks again. Wonderful to see everyone, and have a wonderful day out there.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Muchas gracias.
Bye.
Muito obrigado.